culture. Classic pop culture.
Hi everybody, this is Steve Ludwig, host of Steve Ludwig's Classic Pop Culture and the Beatles Hour with Steve Ludwig at planetludwig.com. Here are two interviews we did with author Jim Berkenstadt, author of The Beatle Who Vanished, Jimmy Nicol. The first interview was show number 29, February 25th, 2014. That'll be followed by the interview we did on show number 46, June 24th, 2014. If you'd like to hear both complete shows, go to planetludwig.com and look for the guest index on the menu. And now, please enjoy the interviews. And our guest right now, everyone, is the author of, I'm telling you, it's an incredible book called The Beatle Who Vanished. Author Jim Berkenstadt is with us, and I will let Mr. Berkenstadt give us some background about what the book's about. But Beatle fans, non-Beatle fans, all music fans, this is a book you must add to your library. The Beatle Who Vanished, author Jim Berkenstadt. Jim, why don't you give us, first of all, welcome to the show, and could you give us a little background about the book? And I have a ton of questions for you.
Okay, well, Steve, first of all, thanks for having me on your show. It's a real pleasure to be here. This book was like 7-8 years in the making, all told. 6 of the years were just spent in the trenches interviewing anybody who knew Jimmy Nicol, researching articles around the world, traveling to England, traveling to Australia, because I always wondered, to me this was a bit of a lost chapter in Beatle history. At least that's how my quest started. It was, well, who was this guy? How did the Beatles pick him to be the temporary drummer when Ringo Starr got sick the day before their first ever world tour and there was no way to change those plans? And so I wanted to know, what was his backstory? What was this guy like? And then I wanted to know, what was it like in the eye of the hurricane, being in the limos, on the planes, on stage with the Beatles, knowing that thousands of fans are screaming and they expect the songs to sound exactly like the records, and you're playing Ringo's parts. You know, imagine the pressure on someone coming out of nowhere and having to do that. And then lastly, my next big question was, well, whatever happened to this guy? Because he seemed to have fallen off the earth. No one's ever talked about him. He's not been written about. And so I really went on this, multi-year quest to find out what I could about this guy, Jimmy Nicol. And my thought was it'd probably be enough for a small article. But what surprised me was what an interesting career this guy had as a drummer. He ended up as a producer, an arranger. He ran a button factory. He was a teacher. He was on the radio. I mean, this guy did a lot of things in his career, and no one ever knew about it. So that fascinated me. And the other thing that was that is what led to the title of the book, The Beatle Who Vanished, is that every time Jimmy Nicol wanted to do something after he had been a temporary Beatle, he was always sort of comparing whatever he accomplished to that same top of the mountain, Beatlemania. And naturally you would come up short with that type of a comparison. So as a result, his way of dealing with these issues was to vanish. And he would, and we'll go into more detail on that, but he would simply walk out his door, get on an airplane, and no one would know where he went. Not his, fellow musicians, family, friends. He just vanished.
Yeah. In 1964, for those fans who might not be aware, Ringo had tonsillitis, and for 13 days, the day before, I guess you would call it a make or break world tour, right, Jim?
Right.
They needed a new drummer.
Yeah, I mean, this was something that Brian Epstein had planned for 6 months. He had flown to different parts of the world. He had tons of correspondence with all of the promoters. In fact, I was able to look at all the correspondence for the Australian leg of the tour when I was in Melbourne. and the promoter had left all this stuff to a museum. And it took me 10 straight hours to read through all this correspondence between him and Brian Epstein.
Oh, my goodness.
You can just imagine all these letters flying back and forth. Every little detail, like if George's guitar doesn't perform or gets lost, we have to have a guitar because he's the lead guitarist. We want you to rent 2 guitars, this kind and that kind. Make sure they're, on stage and ready to go. Make sure Mal Evans has a chance to tune them. The most finite details were covered in an era when they didn't have emails or texting or cell phones and do so much by written correspondence.
Yeah. Oh, my goodness. Talk about concert writers. Now, Jimmy Nicol, just so our listeners can get a little taste of his drumming, and he certainly was a premier drummer. He was in a group. He drummed for Colin Hicks and the Cabin Boys, right, Jim?
That's correct. And Colin Hicks was the younger brother of Tommy Steele, who was a first-generation British rocker and then became more of an all-around entertainer, performing in musicals. And I think he was even in some Disney films as well.
Yeah, so here's a little taste, but what a great drum job of 20 Flight Rock. Now, you Beatles fans will recognize 20 Flight Rock as the song that Paul played when he first met John to prove to John that he had knew his stuff. But listen to this drumming by Jimmy Nicol before he joined the Beatles here. Colin Hicks and the Cabin Boys, 20 Flight Rock. Let's listen right now. So obviously, Jim, Jimmy Nicol was certainly a capable drummer. And can you tell us about The Call? I love the chapter in your book when you called it The Call. When the Beatles called, not the Beatles, but when Jimmy received the call. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. At the time, this was, in May of '64, Jimmy Nicol was playing in a band called Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames. Mm-hmm. And they were like the hottest live band in London. And Paul McCartney, as a bachelor at the time, had gone to see these shows. A lot of them were after midnight. And they would jam, and they'd have different people up on stage with them occasionally. But Jimmy was the drummer at the time. And Georgie Fame became friends with Paul McCartney for the first time during this period. So McCartney had a chance to observe Jimmy Nicol as a live drummer, but not as a studio drummer. And then a month earlier, Brian Epstein had taken one of his proteges, Tommy Quickly, into the studio to record a couple of songs. And just so happens Jimmy Nicol had been the studio session drummer for that particular session. So Brian Epstein had a passing knowledge and observation of Jimmy Nicol at that point. So on the day in question, the Beatles were doing a photo shoot at about 11:30 in the morning. And their plan was then to go over to Abbey Road, which at the time was EMI Studios, in the afternoon, record some tracks, and then the next day fly off on what would be a very lengthy world tour, which would take them to Denmark, the Netherlands, Hong Kong, Australia, and New Zealand. And that was just the first leg of the world tour.
Oh, boy.
So, and in those days, you couldn't fly direct. You know, you had to stop all the time and refuel. So it was a big deal.
Yeah.
And lengthy trip. So Ringo collapsed at this photo session, basically just fainted. And Neil Aspinall picked him up and they took him to the hospital. And it was determined that he had tonsillitis and that he would have to stay in the hospital. And probably nowadays that would not have stopped someone, but back then they took that pretty seriously.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So as a result, Epstein realized, you know, all this planning, all this work can't be undone by a couple of phone calls. You know, there's rooms have been rented all over the world. Tickets are all sold out. There's, you know, all the merchandise is on the shelves, security's in place, police, dignitaries of, you know, everything is planned, ticker tape parades, and it just couldn't be canceled. And back then there were no out clauses in these contracts that would allow for something like that. So the show had to go on. So Epstein first convinced John and Paul that they would have to, you know, allow him to try and get a substitute drummer. And well, they were hesitant, but realized, you know, this had to happen. So then they contacted George, and George said, no, if Ringo's not in the group, we're not the Beatles. And if we're not the Beatles, I'm not going to go. So they had a lot of internal turmoil there, as explained in the book, where they had to convince George Harrison that, you know, even though this maybe morally wasn't the right thing to do, that from a business standpoint, their career could be ruined if they didn't find someone and find them fast. So once that was determined, they started sending people from NEMS down to Soho to the bars looking for people. And without giving away the whole story, Jimmy Nicol was actually the third person that they turned to. The first two turned down the Beatles, which is amazing. And the third person was Jimmy Nicol, and George Martin gave him a call. And he was just sitting at home resting and relaxing after being up all night with Georgie Fame jamming. And it was just one of those moments where, you know, your number's been called, and it's almost like you think you've won the lottery. But I think in his case, it was both a blessing and a curse, as readers will learn. But it was a very exciting moment when he got called and they said, you know, do you have a passport? No. Do you have a suitcase? No. Okay. We'll have to work on that. Actually, a buddy was staying with him, a singer named John Hodkinson, and John said, I'll lend you my suitcase. And then the Beatles, I think Mal Evans helped him get a passport. And then later on, they had to, after the rehearsal, they had to send over a tailor because there was no time to create new stage suits. So he had to fit into Ringo's outfits. So this was really, really last minute stressful stuff for Epstein.
We're speaking with Jim Berkenstadt, the author of the really fine book, The Beatle Who Vanished. Go to www.thebeatlewhovanished.com. also rockandrolldetective.com. We're going to speak about that website a little bit later as well. But
I might add, Steve,
yes.
that if people have accounts with Amazon.com,
Yes.
you can find the book in paperback or ebook there as well.
Yeah, that's great. I'm on Amazon just about every day, for crying out loud. Yeah, that should have been my first choice. Amazon.com for sure. And like Jim said, it's also now available as an ebook. So the tour started, and Jimmy was with them, as it turned out, 13 days with the Beatles. Jim, what were some of the excuse me, I'm sorry. What was some of the dynamics going on? I know each of the Beatles' relationship with Jimmy was unique.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell me first, how did Paul, John, and George? Why don't you tell us about each one, how they took to Jimmy?
Well, I think John was still considered really the leader of the group at the time. And I think that John realized that this is a huge, momentous event that could make or break their career because it's their first ever world tour. You know, it's easy today to think, oh, they were going to be great and they were going to take over the world and Beatlemania would reign in every country. But that wasn't the case on June 3rd, 1964, when Ringo went down. So Lennon realized how serious it was, and he really wanted the Beatles to be successful. And I think that he appreciated Jimmy the most and seemed to realize what Jimmy was going through and tried to really buddy up with him and make him feel comfortable. And I think Paul did the same thing. In fact, the famous story is as the tour went on, Paul would ask Jimmy each day, well, how are things going? And he'd say, well, it's getting better, Paul, getting better all the time. And of course, we know that resulted in at least the title of a song, Getting Better, from Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So, I think Paul and John were real interested. Also, John was interested in Jimmy Nicol because John was a big fan of that first generation of British rock, and Jimmy Nicol had played backup for a lot of those groups because he had started his career in the late 50s, early 60s. So a lot of those bands that were on package tours that would tour through Liverpool occasionally were of great interest to him, so he could ask Jimmy a lot of those questions. Yeah. George was probably the person who maybe wasn't too thrilled, didn't necessarily feel he had to be friends with Jimmy Nicol, but he was going to go along with it and be a good team player.
Right.
But when I studied all of the available video footage and photographs from the tour when Jimmy was on it, you don't really see Jimmy buddying up with George in, say, a plane seat next door to each other or with their arm around him, that sort of thing. That was usually John or Paul. The most interesting bonding aspect on tour was when they started heading off to Hong Kong, which was a very long actual series of flights because they had to refuel in several countries. And the Beatles got on the plane and they were in first class. And once they were up in the air, someone said, we think one of your friends is in the back. And they said, well, get him and send him up. And it turned out it was Tony Sheridan, who the Beatles had backed up in Hamburg.
Sure.
And the big surprise for everyone was Jimmy Nicol knew Tony Sheridan as well as the Beatles because he had played with him on these old package tours and had even temporarily been in one of Tony Sheridan's rock bands called the Wreckers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the plot certainly thickens, everyone. But coincidentally, when the Beatles were appearing on the Ed Sullivan Show back here in February, 50 years ago, Jimmy was actually forming a group called the Shub Dubs. Now, Beatles were on Sullivan in February. In June, he is now touring with the Beatles for 13 days. But why don't we listen to, for me, Jim, I like the B-side of Humpty Dumpty called Night Train by the Shub Dubs. I think it'll give our our listeners another nice little part, or a little section of Jimmy Nichols' talent. So why don't we listen to Night Train, and then when we get back, boy, does the plot thicken. Well, Jim, we're now on tour with the Beatles. You just told us the dynamics with Paul, John, and George. And I guess hindsight, it's hard to believe, but at the time, Ringo was quite worried and insecure about returning to the Beatles. Would they keep Jimmy, or right?
Well, you're right about that. And in fact, there's a brief clip of Ringo in around the mid-'90s that's in the Beatles anthology film where he actually admits that. He said, well, they had gone off without me. Here I am watching them on tour on TV, and I'm sitting in the hospital, and I thought, oh, my boys, they don't love me anymore.
Yeah.
If you think about it, Ringo had only replaced Pete Best for 2 years. Now it was 2 years later, and now here's this other guy sitting in, and I'm sure that Ringo had some sense that Jimmy Nicol was this excellent studio drummer and live drummer in the London area. And, and Ringo was sort of a self-made drummer. Ringo was just rock and roll, whereas Jimmy Nicol had learned jazz and big band drumming and ska and reggae and all these different forms of drumming. And maybe he was a little insecure sitting there wondering, what's going to happen to me?
It is hard to believe. But wouldn't it be, this is maybe for another time for us to speak about, Jim, but wouldn't it be an interesting conversation between Pete Best and Jimmy Nicol? I mean, that would be an interesting conversation. Now,
I actually asked Pete Best when I was researching the book, I asked him whether the Beatles ever called him or considered him when they were looking for a drummer that day, and he said, nope. One word answer, nope.
Yeah. That's certainly, maybe next time you're on, Jim, we'll talk about that sure. Kind of dynamic. All right, so the tour, or I should say Jimmy Nicol's tenure with the Beatles is ending. 13 days are up. Mm-hmm. Ringo returns.
Right.
And Jimmy did not have a nice parting of the ways with Brian Epstein, correct?
That's right. It was a rocky ending to an otherwise very smooth tour. And what happened was Brian Epstein stayed back in London with Ringo, who was in the hospital, and taking care of business. His plan was to escort Ringo to Melbourne once Ringo was well enough to travel and get back together with the band. And So that's what he did. He wasn't around during the bulk of the tour. Now, during most of the tour, Jimmy Nicol was able to change his clothes and go out and walk around, go to pubs, go visit people, sightsee, shop, and not be seen as a Beatle when he would go out the back of these hotels. So he felt very free that he could really be on both sides of the fence. In fact, there was a moment, I think it was in Holland, where after the whole night of, craziness and Beatlemania, he did that, and he actually went outside the hotel where all the kids were screaming and yelling and looked up with them at the window where the Beatles were. So imagine what an interesting feeling you'd go through where you're this everyday guy one day, and the next day girls are ripping your clothes apart, but you still have the ability or the anonymity to be able to put on a trench coat and walk around and see it from both sides at the same time.
Yeah, boy, talk about dynamics. My goodness.
So when he got back, it was rocky because Epstein didn't allow Beatles to just go off on their own and sneak out and such. And when he first got there, the press conference had all 5 Beatles, and most of them were focusing on the sort of comedic repartee between John and Ringo, and Jimmy Nicol felt left out. And if you actually watch that newsreel, he's actually cut out of the picture frame, and he's on the far left. He's not even on camera. So when a reporter asked him what his plans were, he started talking at a fairly loud level, which disrupted the press conference, which enraged Epstein. And the other thing was that Jimmy Nicol planned to fly over back to Sydney, where he had sat in with an American singer named Frances Faye, and he was hoping to latch on with her. And when Epstein, got Jimmy down the hall, he was furious with them and said, "Look, you're going straight to your room. You're going to pack, and tomorrow we're putting you on a plane to London."
Wow.
And there's nothing Nicol could do, and he was a fiercely independent guy. So he was extremely angry. They had strong words. I was able to find a guy in another band on tour with the Beatles who actually was in the hallway and witnessed this. And it really didn't sit well. And Jimmy actually snuck out that night. He wasn't going to take it. He was going to rebel. And he went out to a pub to get a drink, and this was after midnight. And Epstein was always concerned with the Beatles' reputation, keeping it, clean in the news. So when he found out that Nicol wasn't in his room, I think he sent Derek Taylor and Neil Aspinall down to locate him, and they had to find Jimmy and drag him out of this pub and bring him back to the hotel. So more angry words ensued. And, finally the next day they did put him on a plane, but not before giving him the famous engraved "Thank You" watch.
Yeah, thanks, and don't let the door hit you in the backside on the way out. I remember years later watching footage of Jimmy Nicol playing during this time period, and I remember as a fan saying, "Who is this guy? The arms are all over the place. That's not Ringo. His hair wasn't quite long enough yet." But You know what, Jim? Reading your book, Jimmy Nicol is one of the most interesting figures in pop music history.
Yes.
Because, afterwards, I guess he kind of made some tough decisions. He fell into the drug alcohol kind of path, right? And
well, not right away. He tried to make it with a couple of his own bands. Then he vanished for the first time a year after their first tour and was scooped up by a Swedish band. And for 2 years, they were very successful. But he sort of got bored with their style of music. He wasn't able to, like you were saying, flail around as much because they were pretty sort of, I don't know, kind of mellow pop rock instrumental.
We're talking about the Spotniks, correct?
Spotniks, yes, from Sweden. And so I think as he got bored with that style, and they were in Mexico for an extended period of time, he started to get in with people in the underground when he wasn't with the band, and that was sort of the start of a period of drug use. Not necessarily one that continued throughout the rest of his career and life, but certainly for a good 10 years there. But at the same time, he was still, trying to be creative. He latched on as a producer with RCA in Mexico and made an album.
Yeah, he when he was with the Spotniks, they re-recorded or redid a song called Husky, which the Spotniks version. Oh my goodness, talk about drumming. Maybe we should listen. Well, why don't we listen to that now? And it's another great example of Jimmy's drumming. So here's Husky by the Spotniks, and when you hear the word Husky, that's Jimmy Nicol himself. So let's listen to Husky by the Spotniks, Jimmy Nicol on drums. Husky by the Spotniks, and we're speaking with author Jim Berkenstadt, author of The Beatle Who Vanished. This book is available on Amazon.com in paperback and also in ebook. Amazon.com. Look for it, everybody. The Beatle Who Vanished, Jim Berkenstadt. Also go to TheBeatleWhoVanished.com and RockAndRollDetective.com. But I think your best bet is to go on Amazon. You'll find it there in no time with no problem. You mentioned a few minutes ago, Jim, that Jimmy went to Mexico. First of all, he was one talented guy, wasn't he?
He really was. He was multi-talented, and he had learned a little bit about musical arrangement in the studios in 1964, working with Johnny Harris. He was like a sponge. He learned how production worked. So these were things that he wanted to delve into once he got the chance. He got to do a little arranging and producing with the Spotniks because they did about 4 albums or so with him. And then that was something he wanted to pursue when he vanished again after the Spotniks. And so it was something that he got involved in.
And it was sort of a double-edged sword because there were times you mentioned in the book, Jim, and you communicated so well that the Beatles were okay to him when he needed the Beatles Association was okay when he needed them to get a gig in Mexico, for instance, but
Mm-hmm.
Also, he was unhappy with the label, right? Could you talk about that dynamic with us?
Yes, it was a double-edged sword. It was a blessing and a curse. So, for example, when he first left the Spotniks, first of all, none of the Spotniks who I interviewed had any idea whatever happened to Jimmy Nicol after he left them. And I said, well, where do you think he went? Because it's easy now that the book is out. Everyone could say, well, he went to Mexico. But
Right.
that was something that took about a year or so to find out, because there were no records of this. And they thought he had gone to Brazil because, as they said, he loved bossa nova music and pretty women. So he was always talking about Brazil. We thought he went to Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
So it took a long time, and I think the way I stumbled across it was that every single day I went to eBays around the world and would plug in Jimmy Nicol, and there's so many different misspellings. There's Jimmy, Jimmy, and then people spell nickel 3 or 4 ways. Sometimes they put an S on the end.
Right.
So I always have to enter about 6 different Jimmy Nicols, and one day up pops this album called Los Nickelquin. And I was like, this is pretty interesting. I wonder if the nickel part is Jimmy. And I emailed the guy, and he read the back of this album cover and said, yeah, it's a guy named Jimmy Nicol, and it mentions a little bit about the Beatles. And I said, oh my gosh, this is a real lead here. So I bought the album. And I think it cost $40, and there's one on eBay now going for $7,000 because,
wow.
I mentioned in the book how rare it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you, thanks to you, Jim, we're going to be able to listen to one of the songs from Los Nickelquin, and I like this song so much. It's called Unknown, because I feel it really shows how creative and willing Jimmy was to take chances. And plus, Jimmy does the vocals throughout the song. So, might be a good time to listen to the song Unknown by Los Nickelquin.
There's a trail for everyone. Don't go halfway. Follow me, follow me, follow me, follow me. I feel strong. You feel weak. I can help you. Come along, come along, come along, come along. They said they found me dead somewhere with my eyes open wide, looking nowhere. The world around me was moving no more. What happened there? I felt so sure, I went so fast, got me by the wind. I'm just like the others. I know.
Unknown. Jimmy Nicol in Los Nickelquin, and we're speaking with Jim Berkenstadt, author of The Beatle Who Vanished, available on Amazon.com. thebeatlewhovanished.com, but Amazon.com is the place you want to go, guys, to get the book. It's available ebook and paperback. And, Jim, we mentioned also rockandrolldetective.com. You're the rock and roll detective. Can you just briefly tell us what that website and what you do, not just with Jimmy Nickel detective work, but what's Rock and Roll Detective about?
Well, that's my consulting company, and what I do is I try to uncover the lost history and mysteries hidden within decades of popular music. And so I've consulted to the Beatles company Apple over the years, to George Harrison while he was alive, and then the estate of George Harrison. For example, I was the consultant in the Martin Scorsese film, George Harrison Living in the Material World. I was the historical consultant on that.
Great film, by the way.
Oh, thank you. I thought it was fantastic.
Yeah.
Worked on the Cirque du Soleil project with the Beatles, the Help box set, the Dark Horse Years, Traveling Wilburys box sets, and then non-Beatle things, but also in music. For example, I did some work for Barbara Orbison and let's see, who else? Well, VH1 Behind the Music. I consulted on a couple of their shows.
Boy, wow.
Dick Clark did a special called the Teen Idol special. So different things, films, documentaries, record album, or DVD box sets, CD box sets, that kind of thing. I just try to dig things up for people and help them find it out or research. They might want a magazine cover for a shot in a documentary. You never know.
Well, listeners, we are going to stop the story here. Buy the book because I know it's on all of your minds about Jimmy Nickel. Is he alive? Is he dead? Did Jim Berkenstadt get in touch with him? Well, that's why you have to go to Amazon.com, everyone, and pick up The Beatle Who Vanished by Jim Berkenstadt. Jim, we're not going to give any spoilers here. We're going to leave it right here. Is that good with you?
Yeah, that's good. And if people want autographed copies, they can go to my site, thebeatlewhovanished.com, and use PayPal or charge card, and it's just as easy. If they already have an account with Amazon, they don't care about autographs, it's just as easy to go there.
I will say this. Leading up, as the book gets near the end, I was as excited as I've ever been reading a book, and I'll leave it just at that. And Jim, I want to thank you so much for being with us once again. Jim Berkenstadt, the Beatle is the book is The Beatle Who Vanished, about Jimmy Nickel, and go to Amazon.com. Check out thebeatlewhovanished.com for an autographed copy, and these websites that we've been talking about tonight will all be on Planet Ludwig on the links page. And Jim, I hope we can speak again sometime because you have a lot of other rock and roll stories that you can share with us. If you'd be so kind to join us again sometime.
Steve, it would be my honor to come back on, and thanks very much for having me on tonight.
Thank you, Jim. It's been a pleasure. And guys, read this book. You will thank Jim Berkenstadt for doing all the legwork for us. Thanks again, Jim.
Thank you, Steve.
We're joined right now by a gentleman who was on back in February, and I read his book cover to cover. I finished it in 2 nights because it was one of the most fascinating books, and certainly for Beatle fans it's fascinating, but for music fans and just for detective fans, if I may say that. He wrote a book called The Beatle Who Vanished. I'm going to let him tell us all about it, and then I have my list of questions all ready. But the reason why we're having Mr. Jim Berkenstadt on here in June again is because it's a particular anniversary. Welcome, Jim Berkenstadt.
Hey, thanks very much, Steve. I really enjoy being on your show again.
I'll tell you, the first time, it was our pleasure, Jim, the first time you were on it. It seemed to me that there was so much more that we had to talk about. So I'm so glad you found the time in your busy schedule to come back. I want to tell our listeners that when you get some time, go back and check out show number 29 in the archives, February 25th, when Jim was first on, because we played a lot of, thanks to Jim, we played a lot of Jimmy Nickel music and things, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Jim, why don't you tell those of us who are those of our listeners who are hearing you for the first time, who may have missed that show, tell us about The Beatle Who Vanished.
A lot of other
Well, The Beatle Who Vanished is the first historical account of Jimmy Nicol, who was an unknown drummer. And this is his journey from humble beginnings of playing drums in coffee houses and just trying to pick up with any band, and climbing the ladder of London's music world in the late 50s and early 60s, all the way to the point of saving the Beatles' first world tour. But that was really only part of his legend, because although he had these 13 days of fame that made headlines with the Beatles, the true mystery of this guy, Jimmy Nicol, is just riddled with like blacklisting, betrayal, drugs, divorce, bankruptcy, and eventually he disappeared, and this led many people to question whether he's dead or alive. So it's sort of a history and a mystery.
One of the reviews of your book, Jim, if I can just give an excerpt, it said, it reads like a great detective novel, except everything is true. It is, you go from page to page as a reader, and you say, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And none of it, it's all true. It's such an incredibly exciting story.
Thanks. It was, it was incredibly exciting to research it and then, put it all in the correct order and write it. And I just was hoping that people would enjoy it. And Steve, I'm certainly glad that you like it. Thank you. And
I love it. And
it's awesome.
Yeah, I mentioned at the top of the interview that you don't have to even be, let alone a Beatle fan, but a music fan, just a fan of mystery. And what makes it that much more exciting, like I said, is that it's true. First of all, how long did it take you to total from starting the research to finishing it, Jim? How long must have been?
The research on and off took about 6 years. And there were times where I would reach a dead end where I didn't know where Nicol had vanished to, and the last people who had seen him didn't know either. And so, the trail would run cold, and then something would happen where I would get lucky, like maybe I would find a teen magazine at eBay in Mexico, and I'd have it translated, and next thing you know, I'd figure out what happened and how he got to Mexico. So I really had a lot of luck and a lot of I guess there's luck and skill in these things, but, I was constantly trying to come up with out-of-the-box ideas for Google to search things. One time I searched Colin Hicks plus jail, because he had played in a band called Colin Hicks and the Cabin Boys, and one of those band members told me that they thought Colin Hicks was in prison. And I thought, maybe I can find him in prison and write him a letter. Well, instead I found some really horrible, like X-rated S&M website.
This is what Jimmy Nicol's been up to.
And
First interview was show number 29,
right?
February 25th, 2014.
There was this guy named
That'll
Max,
be followed by an
and
interview
he's
we
the
did on
creator
show
of
number
this
46,
website, and he
June
wrote a
24th,
bio that said when I was like a teenager, I was the roadie for Colin Hicks and the Cabin Boys in Italy. So I called up, and they were like, "Who wants to talk to him? Are you with the FBI?" All this stuff I had to go through. And finally they put him on the phone, and he's a real pleasant guy, and he goes, "Oh yeah, I knew Jimmy Nicol. Let me tell you all these stories." So you get lucky sometimes, but it also comes from knowing, what words to search for or where to go and look. But that took 6 years, and then another 2 years in terms of layout and getting all the photos I wanted. There's over 120 photos in this book.
Incredible photos, by the way.
Yeah, and a lot of people donated them, loaned them for the book, and then I went to various archives to license them. That takes a while, and then you lay it all out, and then self-publishing takes time to figure out what that's all about. So
sure,
8 years total, but it was a real passion. I enjoyed it.
I want all our listeners, before we go any further, to know how to get the book. We're going to mention this throughout the interview. You can get the paperback edition of The Beatle Who Vanished on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. For you ebook fans, go to Amazon.com. And for me, go to TheBeatleWhoVanished.com. You can get a first edition author-signed copy by Jim on TheBeatleWhoVanished.com. And I suggest you check out that website anyway, because, Jim, you have so many nice media things on there, too. People can actually put a face to the name, and you have videos of Jimmy and Great
You can
website.
see him drumming, and you can hear some of his experimental music. It's pretty interesting.
Was there a point, Jim, where you almost gave up and you said, you know what, I'm never going to find out definitively one way or the other if Jimmy Nichols is even alive or dead? Or did you say, no way I'm giving up on this. I am taking it till I find out the answer?
You know, Steve, there were times where I guess technically I gave up along those 6 years and said, you know, I've reached too many dead ends, and maybe I just need to rethink this, or maybe just write an article. And so there were a few times where I stopped and worked on other projects, but something always brought me back. You know, I guess it was my desire to find out what happened to this guy. Did he die? Did he fake his death? You know, like that Paul McCartney is dead type of thing.
Yeah.
What really happened to this guy, and where did he go, and who else can I find that knew him somewhere along the way? And so by taking breaks, I guess, when I probably did sort of temporarily give up and coming back to it with sort of fresh ideas, I was able to, I think, complete the pieces in the puzzle.
Yeah, you sure did. I don't know if I mentioned at the top of the interview exactly why did Jimmy Nichols spend 13 days with the Beatles?
Well, especially for those who don't know, but it really happened 50 years ago. On June 3rd, Ringo Starr collapsed during a photo session and had to go off to the hospital. Turns out he had tonsillitis and had to stay in the hospital for 13 days, or I think 12 days plus 1 day to get back together with the group on the other side of the world. But the Beatles were about to leave on their first ever world tour the very next day, and now it was like 12 noon. So they, first Epstein had to convince the band that they had to go on and they had to get a substitute. George Harrison was dead set against it, and they really had to work on him to turn him around. And it really could have hurt their career at that point in time if they hadn't found someone. Because in those days, you couldn't get out of contracts for illness. There was no insurance to back up promoters who had sold tickets and would have to refund them all. They would have ended up suing the Beatles. The public relations would have been a nightmare for the Beatles if they had canceled. Record sales would have been affected. So many things would have really gone down the tubes if they hadn't found a substitute.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
It took them really, the better part of several hours to find someone.
He wasn't their first choice, was he?
No, he wasn't. He was actually the third choice. And the first guy had his own club and had his own gig and didn't think the Beatles were, that great. And he just said,
oh boy. Famous last words, right, Jim?
Hey. And then the second guy, Bobby Graham, who's passed away, he was a really big-time session player at the time. And so he was the guy that would be the drummer on a Kinks song or on some other big British rock band instead of the regular drummer who maybe went off on tour, because he knew how to play really well in the studios. So he was in high demand, and he said, geez, if I go off on this tour, when I come back in 2 weeks or however long it is, the guy that chooses us will put me down to the bottom of the list, and I won't be making any money. He'll punish me for a month. I can't afford to do that. Mm-hmm. So he said, but there's this guy who's quite a good drummer, Jimmy Nichols. Why don't you try calling him? And so sure enough, they did.
Of course, knowing how the Beatles turned out, but it's not that hard to believe, I guess, of the first two turning down the offer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, right. The Beatles, and for all intents and purposes, again, the old cliche, hindsight is 20/20, but right. Jimmy Nichols could very well have saved the Beatles' backs by stepping in for Ringo, being able to take his place for 13 days.
Yeah, it's really true, because back then, pop stars had very, very short shelf life. They even if you listen to old interviews, people do when, the bubble bursts and they say, well, in a year or so, we'll, I'm going to be a hairdresser, or John and I will go on composing, or whatever it was. they always expected that it would only last 2-3 years.
Mm-hmm. Once again, we're speaking with author Jim Berkenstadt with the incredible book, The Beatle Who Vanished. It's available on Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com, the paperback edition. That's The Beatle Who Vanished. If you'd like the ebook edition, go to Amazon.com. And for me, the best, if you want an author-signed first edition copy, go to thebeatlewhovanished.com. Jim Berkenstadt is with us. Do you when I thought of this question, Jim, I thought it might sound silly, but I don't know. Do you think after everything, Jimmy Nicol would have been happier with his career had he not sat in for these 13 days? Looking back at what happened, Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's a great question. And of course we can't put ourselves inside his head, but it was both a blessing and a curse getting to play with the Beatles. Obviously the opportunity to get the name recognition, to be, known worldwide, to get the opportunity to have played on stage at the height of Beatlemania, is quite the blessing. But yet it sort of turned into a curse for him because a lot of his plans that he thought were, surefire, successful music plans didn't always pan out the way he expected. And so I suppose he came to somehow blame the Beatles. And at times he told one of his ex-wives who I interviewed in Mexico that he felt that it was Brian Epstein's fault that he wasn't successful on his own, and he felt Brian had blacklisted him.
Because why would Brian blacklist him in Jimmy's mind?
At the end of Jimmy's tour with the Beatles, Brian flew Ringo back from London to Melbourne, and Jimmy started doing some side interviews at the press conference when the five Beatles were at the press conference table, and that annoyed Epstein because that's bad manners and because he felt it was self-serving. When that press conference ended, he pulled Jimmy aside and just berated him in front of everyone. Okay. And one of the people I interviewed was a drummer on that same bill and with Sounds Incorporated, and the drummer said that Epstein really ripped into him, and Jimmy wasn't used to that. Jimmy was used to being treated with respect. Jimmy was very independent, and he didn't appreciate that at all, and he gave it back as well as he received it. And Epstein said, just go back to your room and pack your bag, you're done. And also at the time, Nicol expected to fly to Sydney because Frances Faye, he had met her there when the Beatles stopped in Sydney briefly. And she had said that she'd love for him to fly back to the States with her and work on a new album and be her drummer, et cetera, et cetera. And that was something he was interested in. And Epstein said, nope, I've got you a one-way ticket to London, and that's where we're sending you. On the last night, the Beatles were having another, party up in the suite. And Jimmy didn't feel much like hanging out with them because he felt like they had sort of closed ranks again. Now that Ringo was back, he was mad at Epstein. So he disappeared from the hotel and went out drinking. And when Epstein discovered he wasn't in his room, he blew his stack again and sent some of his, road crew out to get Jimmy. And Jimmy said, why are you pulling me back in? I'm just having a beer. And they said, because you're coming with us because you're still a Beatle. And he's like, I'm not a Beatle anymore. And they said, you are a Beatle until we put you on that airplane. So those bad feelings between Nicol and Epstein in Jimmy Nicol's head turned into the thought that Epstein would try to derail his solo career when he got back to England because Epstein had so much power in the industry.
Yeah, you almost get the feeling that the other four Beatles probably had gone through this with Epstein at the beginning, and they kind of knew when to shut up. But Jimmy was learning on the spot.
Right, and he was older than they were. They were younger, so they were more likely to do what the manager had told them. And, of course, he had gotten them to this point of great fame and helped them a lot. So They were used to being in boxes, you know, being in a car, being in a backstage area, being in a hotel room, and doing what they were told because they kept seeing their good fortune rising.
Yeah. You know, I think on the surface, of course, the interesting part of the book is because Jimmy Nicol played these 13 days with the Beatles. But I'm telling you, after I read the book, even if he hadn't played with the Beatles, he is such an interesting and complex character.
It's really true. You know, most of the letters that I get from readers who've read the whole book tell me that they went into reading the book because they wanted to hear about the part where he was with the Beatles on tour,
sure.
what it was like. But they all seem to say that they loved the last third of the book more than any other part of the book because it was so strange and mysterious, and where's he going next, and what's he working on? He's doing all these interesting projects, and you know, he sort of diversified himself as time went on. He wasn't just a drummer. He got into arranging, producing, teaching music theory. He was on the radio. He had a button factory. He was an A&R guy for RCA in Mexico. And you know, I detail all these crazy things he did. And I think people find that even more fascinating once they've been through the Beatle part of the book.
I agree, because like most readers, I think that's what I went into the book initially for. Wow, let me hear about this 13 days that I kind of just read articles about. But it is peripheral to the Jimmy Nicol story.
It's somewhat of a 3-act play where you have the backstory. Who is this guy? Where did he come from? Then you have, okay, he gets this moment of fame. It's 15 minutes of fame is Act 2. And then Act 3 is, how do you live with those 15 minutes of fame the rest of your life? How do you deal with that?
Yeah. In his heart, did Jimmy feel he was a better drummer than Ringo?
Well, you know, he never really came out and said that in those words, but he probably felt, I would guess, that he was a better drummer in that he could read music, he could sight read, he could play many more styles of music than Ringo because he knew big band drumming, he knew reggae, blues, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, jazz. He was a jazz drummer. So he probably felt that he had, you know, more chops than Ringo. But the thing is that, you know, it's kind of apples and oranges because Ringo recorded these tight pop songs with the Beatles that had a beginning and an end, and they weren't about flourishing drum parts and drum solos. They were about sort of teamwork playing. Every one of the Beatles played to make the song better, and I think that's why all the Beatles songs are so memorable, and we all still love hearing them decades later. They hold up. And Jimmy, as a drummer who had been, you know, in all these bands and been sort of a flashy character in these other bands, he was used to, you know, sort of showing off. There's a telling photo in the book where all 3 Beatles, John, Paul, and George, in Adelaide, are bowing at the end of a Beatles song, and yet Jimmy Nicol is still playing on, you know, sort of an ending flourish on his own, whereas Ringo would have been bowing and would have ended the song exactly on the same note as all the other Beatles.
Yeah, that is very telling. That's so true. You know, we mentioned earlier when Brian was maybe less than kind to Jimmy at the end. Why don't we listen? Rick, we were going to play these 2 excerpts separately, but let's play them back to back, Rick. First one is when Jimmy answered a question, how it was taking over for Ringo. And then the second brief excerpt of an interview is the one that, knowing what we know now, before heading back to England, Brian put on a very nice face in the interview, and here's what Brian had to say about Jimmy. So, Rick, why don't we play both of them back to back, and then we'll get back with Jim.
You're on, Jimmy. Whether you find it difficult to take over the role of Ringo?
No, not really. No. As far as Ringo, I can never make up for what Ringo is. You know.
How long have you been doing this?
Until next Thursday.
Next Thursday.
Yes.
So you're sort of understudy.
Yes, I am.
You think
The Beatles manager, Brian Epstein, is here with you this morning to say farewell, and I'd like to bring him on camera because I know he would like to say a word before you leave.
I'd just like to say to you, Jimmy, that the Beatles and I are really very, very grateful for everything that you've done. You've carried out a fine job for us, and we're very pleased. I hope you have a great trip back to London, and every success to you in the future. Thank you very much, Brian.
Very telling, as you mentioned before, Jim. What about an interesting part of the book? So many interesting parts. I keep saying an interesting part. There were so many interesting parts of the book. But what about Jimmy's relationship with his son, Howie? That's kind of an interesting dynamic.
It really is. I mean, because I think Howie, his son, was probably about 5 or 6 years old when Jimmy got divorced from his wife, and then Howie went to live with his mom. And Jimmy went back to his mom's house to live with his mom after the divorce. And then one day he gets this call a year after the Beatles, a little more than a year, in 65, and it's from these guys, the Sputniks in Sweden, asking him to come join their band and tour the world. And so he left his son Howie in 1965, and he never came back to London for about 10 years. He was on this odyssey of vanishing and reappearing and reinventing himself and his career. So if you think, a kid from age 5 to 15, those are some very important years to be absent as a father. So and I couldn't imagine, how difficult that must have been for a young boy, to sort of lose his father for all that time and be estranged and away from him. You couldn't just hop on a plane in those days. It was too expensive for most people, and fly to another country. So, I'm sure that had an impact on their relationship. And then it seemed like in the 1980s, they seemed to get back together as father and son because they attended the 1984 Holland Beatles convention, and Howie sort of acted as Jimmy's manager for that. And the two of them attended and for the most part had a good time, although they did argue somewhat in an unreleased interview, which I was able to obtain from that time, where Jimmy was talking about that he was working on his own book, that he would tell his own story. That book never came out. But in telling about it, he mentioned, about, well, I was a Beatle at that time. And his son says, well, you weren't really a Beatle. You were sort of in the band and you helped them out. And you could tell that got into an argument. And he most definitely said, yes, I was a Beatle for those days. I was a Beatle. So he was, of course, treated as a Beatle, and
especially at the end, right? Get out of that bar.
Well, yeah, exactly. So, I think after that, then when Jimmy asked his son Howie to lie in the mid-'90s and tell people who were looking for him that he had died, that put Howie in a very tough position because he was telling people that his father had died, and that's how the word spread, and it stayed that way for quite a long time. And when people did start to find out that Jimmy wasn't dead after the lie, that was very embarrassing for Howie. So I just think that their relationship, suffered probably again because of that.
Yeah. Was that before or after Howie had worked on Beatles Anthology, which to me is incredible in itself?
Yeah, what a coincidence. It's right around that time because I think they were working on the anthology in 94, and Howie was working on it. And at the same time, a little bit before that, 94 would have been the 30th anniversary of Jimmy Nicol playing in the Netherlands, and so the same convention guy came back 10 years later and told me he knocked on Howie's door and said, hey, it's, the 10 more years have gone by. We know that you and Jimmy had a nice time at the convention. We'd love to have you come back this year, 1994. And would you please ask your dad, Jimmy Nicol, if he'll agree to be our star guest? And it's at that time that Howie said, I can't. He's dead.
Boy, wow.
And, yeah, I mean, what a dramatic moment for this guy to hear that and go, okay, I'm really sorry. And then he left and went back to Holland.
We're speaking with Jim Berkenstadt. I can't give enough superlatives for the book. It's The Beatle Who Vanished. You can get The Beatle Who Vanished in paperback on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. You can get the ebook edition on Amazon.com. You can get an author-signed first edition on the website, TheBeatleWhoVanished.com. Two more questions, Jim. Well, actually, a few more questions, but two more that I absolutely want to ask you. Have you ever spoken to Pete Best? And has Pete Best ever said anything about Jimmy Nicol?
Well, I guess twice is the answer. I've spoken to him several times and met him several times. But for the book, I sent him an email one day and asked him if, when the Beatles were looking for a drummer to replace Ringo, whether they happened to call him. And he gave me a one-word answer, which was no. And I think a reporter asked John Lennon at the time, and he said, no, we didn't want to do that to Pete, especially since they had fired him, to bring him back would have been in bad form. Then this past February, I had the chance to chat with him backstage because I was a guest speaker at the Cancun Beatles 50th anniversary.
What a terrible place to have a convention, huh? Cancun.
I had
what a shame.
New York and Cancun. And even though the Beatles have nothing to do with Cancun, I went to Cancun with Pete Best.
You took one for the team.
I did. It was brutal in February. So I gave him a copy of the book backstage, and he said, wow, I'm really looking forward to this. This should be very interesting. But as to expressing any sort of opinion or anything, he just said, well, I'll just read the book and see what I think. But we haven't talked since then. But I'm sure I'll run into him someplace at a convention or something sometime, and I'll ask him what he thought of it.
Do you think Jimmy Nicol is aware of your book, or do you know that he is, as a matter of fact, aware of it?
Do you even know if he's alive is the first thing.
Well, that's true. That's true.
I would say this. If Jimmy Nicol is alive, he's got to be aware of this book by now. But because I know his son Howie's aware of the book, because people who know him tell me that he is aware of it or has seen it or something. If he's dead, then I don't think he cares.
I don't think he'd have too much to say about it.
Yeah.
And it's so clever, Jim, the way as the book draws to a conclusion, how we find out dead, alive, maybe. It's just, you have to read the book, everybody. And of course, we're not going to give away the ending, but it's just so clever the way the ending of the book resolves everything.
Thank you.
Yeah. Before we say goodbye, a great thing about the website, The Beatle Who Vanished, is you have a lot of nice media things on, a lot of nice Jimmy Nicol things. But you recently were on the Artie Lang show, which unfortunately, I can't believe that it's not on any longer. I loved the show, but your segment on the show was really a nice interview with Artie Lang.
Oh, thanks, Steve. I appreciate that. It was a blast. He was really into the book. And I could tell when we chatted, even camera before it started, that he was already halfway through the book. He had read half of it, and so that was pretty. It's nice, when you can talk to people who actually have read it and are into that sort of thing. He's a big Beatles fan, and so was his
sidekick there.
Sidekick, yeah.
Yeah. What'd you think of? You wrote a book, Nirvana, on the Nevermind LP. You must have some thoughts about when Paul was with Dave and Chris and recorded the song "Cut Me Some Slack."
I thought it was really cool. I remember when I was researching the book, Nevermind Nirvana, that I read some quotes here and there where Paul McCartney had said, "Oh, I just love Nirvana, and I love that album, Nevermind," and in a way, it's almost full circle, because Cut Me Some Slack, which Paul did with them, was if you listen closely, it's a jam session. And it did start out as a very organic jam, because a friend of mine, Butch Vig, who produced Nevermind, also produced that track with Paul and the remaining members of Nirvana. But if you listen closely and then you listen to the song Helter Skelter, you can really see some similarities to the structure of the song. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting, to kind of come full circle. So I was thrilled with the idea. I like to hear Paul scream and rock out.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I thought it was a great track, and it won Rock Song of the Year.
Yeah.
And in fact, my friend Butch picked up a Grammy that night. In fact, what's interesting is Butch read The Beatle Who Vanished, because he's a drummer also, and he was, interested to read my next book, and Butch wrote, "This is a fascinating and mysterious must-read for hardcore Beatle fans and anyone who wants to understand the meteoric rise to pop stardom and the subsequent crash landing." Kind of sums it up.
It does. Great quote. And that's so true about the book. Jim, I want to thank you so much for returning to us. I still feel that there's so much more we need to talk about. Could I impose upon you in a few months to come back? Because
I would love to come on your show anytime. The questions are always so fascinating. They really make me think. I love it.
Well, the subject matter, it's easy to come up with questions with this book. Once again, everyone, we've been speaking with author Jim Berkenstadt. Get the book, The Beatle Who Vanished. The paperback copies available on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. Ebook is available on Amazon.com, and the author-signed first edition book available on the book's website, TheBeatleWhoVanished.com. Jim, just as much as the first time, even more so, such a pleasure to speak with you, and I look forward to speaking with you again.
Same here, Steve. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to speaking to you again. Thanks again for having me on.
It's been our pleasure. Thanks so much.